All right, my name is Chuck Winninger. My grandfather and father were ranchers in the Meeteetse area for 65 years, I would say. My grandfather and my grandmother were homesteaders over by Gillette and Buffalo. Her father was one of the original settlers in Buffalo, and my grandmother's older sister was the first white woman born in Johnson County. And there were plenty of Native Americans born there, but my Aunt Helen was the first white girl that was born in that county. And they started out with a tent mercantile. And the settlers and the travelers through would stop and they'd sell things. And then they gradually grew it up into what was called the Occidental Hotel, which is still there. It's like the Irma of Cody or some of the old historic hotels for the area. And he lost it playing poker in a poker game. The whole motel, the deed to it. And so for generations we've been scolded and warned of the evils of gambling for 3 generations now. But she homesteaded there. My grandfather homesteaded in Gillette. They met at one of those dances they have. Were married in 1910, and then they had a really bad winter, lost over 1,000 head of sheep, and decided they would come somewhere that wasn't quite so flat. So they ended up in business with a fellow named Eichner and bought the Wayuu Ranch in 1922 down on the Grable River. That's where my father was born, and so that's how we got here. From 1922 to 1934, they were on the Wayuu, which is on the Grable. My father was born in that brick home that's still there upstairs, just he and his mom. It was in a snowstorm, and the doctor couldn't get there. So anyway, the way my dad tells it, was just me and mom. So. And then in 1934, Eichner and Winninger got out of business together, and my grandfather started up on Meeteetse Creek. My grandfather ran sheep from Upper Grable to the top of Carter, to the top of Rattlesnake, all the way down to Burlington. Basically, this whole area here probably covered, 60 miles across, and of course, that was just when they were starting to homestead and free range was disappearing. And when he died in 1943, he had 4,400 head of sheep and 400 head of cows and 60 horses. I have his inventory from December 31st, 1942. He had picked up the habit of chewing tobacco from one of his sheep herders, and he overindulged and he got stomach cancer and died in an operating room in Billings, Montana in 1943. So a lot of the inventory and everything was quite well documented because he knew he was pretty sick in late 1942. And then my grandmother took over, and that was kind of a change of the whole perspective, I guess you'd say. My grandmother, of course, is a widow. In 1943. The way you made it back in those days, of course my grandfather ran away from home in 1900 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, jumped on a freight train, came out to thought he was going to Texas, got off the train in Cheyenne, Wyoming, he and his brother, and the way he accumulated all of his property was tending sheep on shares. Then when he had enough sheep, then he would go to the bank and buy some land, and then he would leverage that land to get some more land. So when he died, he had his name on, I'm not saying it was paid for, 70,000 acres. He had 4,400 sheep and 400 cattle and 60 horses, and my grandmother has to take over all of this. This land is spread over 60 miles, and so my father is only just graduated in high school at this time, and he joins World War II, becomes a sailor. And so my grandmother set about the task of consolidating the property, paying off the debts, and so she liquidated about 55,000 acres, or traded, and turned it all into a cattle operation up on Meeteetse Creek, because that was easier to manage. Took a lot less people and a lot less labor, different kinds of arrangements you had to make to run the sheep, and so it became a cattle operation. And over the period of from 1943 to 1950, my grandmother held it together until he got out of World War II and finished at the University of Wyoming, and then he came back and started in the cattle business. Okay, he started out with Herefords, and eventually Dad developed, he became quite famous in the United States with cow-calf management, because he was a UW graduate. There weren't a whole lot of, I guess, college-educated farmers and ranchers in those days, and so he had all these fresh ideas and stuff out of the University of Wyoming Extension Service, and he did performance testing. He researched cattle tags. They didn't have cattle tags when he started. He indexed cattle. He bought performance-tested bulls. Eventually, he sold commercial bulls to a ranch in Hawaii. All the ranches, a lot of the bigger ranches in Wyoming, and some to Florida. And then he was instrumental in refining how to artificially inseminate a ranch herd. You know, they did it in dairies, but not in the range. And because of that skill that he developed, and then he started to import, semen from bulls in Europe. And when I was 1970, I remember he took the whole family to Europe, and we toured all the bull studs and went to the top of the Alps to see the Simmental cattle, and down to Italy to see the Chianinas, and to Germany to see the Gelbviehs, and because he wanted to know what kind of seed stock they had in Europe. And then through artificial insemination, we were able to create those, breeds here. And so in 1973, he had developed what was called purebred at that time, Simmentals, and had a sale and sold them all out. It wasn't his ideal goal, but it was lucrative, and it was, I guess, the current rage in the cattle business at the time. And so he kind of went from great Herefords all the way up to having European cattle, but his favorite cow was a Jersey Hereford or Jersey Angus cross, and that was a smaller cow, They gave lots of milk. She was pretty nimble, could travel the, sagebrush areas, and didn't take a lot of feed, and had a large pelvis, and so she could deliver a large calf, and that was his ideal cow. And the Simmental was the bull that he preferred to use with those. Dad never did things quite the way other people did. When he first came to the ranch in the 50s, order buyers would come around and they'd come to your ranch and they'd say, we'll give you, 20 cents a pound for your calves or whatever. And then they would sell them to feeders in Nebraska and Iowa. Well, Dad always thought that there was too much markup, that the order buyer was good. So he started going back to Iowa and would go to the sale barns and he would advertise and saying, I'm the rancher that raised these cattle. And he kind of developed a following and could get better price for his cattle because he represented them and could tell a little bit about the history. And of course, all Iowa farmers were, enamored about a guy in a cowboy hat who really did raise these cattle. So from that affiliation in the 50s, by the time we got to the 70s, Dad wanted to have a cattle herd and a feedlot in Iowa. So when I got out of college, I went there and managed that feedlot, and we started a cow herd with his favorite cow, the Jersey Hereford cross. And in the 80s, we continued the kind of the pattern my grandfather started, and that's to borrow money to build. We owed quite a bit of money against our new operation, and interest rates went to 17%. And so in order to kind of, save the operation, we sold the cattle and the farm, and that was about 1,600 stock cows and about 1,500 acres in farmland, and to pay off our debts. And I put 10 years into my life, into it at that time, and my wife really wasn't a farm girl. So I chose not to stay with the ranch when we came back to Cody. My brother really wasn't cut out for it either, so Dad thought this was too much work for a guy who's 60. So he just liquidated. That was the end of the ranching on Meteets Creek. It was 14,000 acres, and a lot of it was state land and school sections, things like that. It was about half deeded and half leased, and so it wasn't a large ranch. Dad always bought his hay, because up there, the growing season was so short that we didn't even have 60 days frost-free, so he would buy his hay down by Powell and Cody and haul it up there, and that way he could run a few more cattle on the meadows and the range. So he had quite a system of using the range and supplementing the acreage that way.